All four of us have lived in Jacksonville for all of our lives, and one of the things that we've learned about our city is that it has a fascinating history. There are so many aspects of history in our city that are overlooked and forgotten, but it is our goal to keep these stories alive.
In the process of delving into Jacksonville's history, we discovered an article written by a historian named Charles Tingley. Tingley wrote an article about an unexpected hero of the yellow fever epidemic of 1888. We contacted and interviewed Tingley via Zoom, and he provided a vast range of information as well.
Well, first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Charles Tingley. I'm the Senior Research Librarian for the St. Augustine Historical Society.
But every great story in history begins with a travesty. Similarly to how we've been learning to cope with the regulations and conditions of COVID-19, the people of Jacksonville were forced to endure a much smaller and yet still devastating epidemic in the year of 1888.
It began small, like every epidemic in history, beginning in 1887. The Civil War had just ended a couple of years before the yellow fever took its toll on Florida. Brought to Jacksonville in 1888 by a saloon keeper under the name of Richard T. McCormick, the yellow fever spread quickly, tearing through the city like a raging wildfire.
To understand how devastating this epidemic was, we must delve into the yellow fever's history. The yellow fever originated in Africa. Even though the first recorded cases of the virus were in Central and coastal South America, West Africa has always been considered the home of the disease.
The source of the yellow fever was thought to be mosquitoes. Because of Florida's hot and humid climate, the virus was able to spread even more quickly through the area.
After nearly 8 weeks, Jacksonville had experienced a total of 1,475 cases, and 202 people had died because of the deadly virus. In order to protect themselves and their families, roughly 2/3 of the population fled. However, some people felt that they needed to stay in Jacksonville with their families, while others had no choice but to remain in the suffering city because they did not have the funds or resources to depart.
By the time the epidemic had passed, the city had a total of 427 recorded deaths and 4,656 recorded cases of the yellow fever. The event was a calamitous disaster, resulting in many lost lives. Many physicians weren't brave enough to stay behind and help the city move through the epidemic. However, one man who stayed behind, risking it all in doing so, was an unexpected hero in this devastating time.
Long before the outbreak of yellow fever, when slavery was still legal, Alexander Darnes was born into the Smith household as a slave. Though the identity of his father was unknown, Alexander's mother was a slave by the name of Violet Pinckney.
Kirby Smith and Alexander Darnes grew up in the same household, and it is believed that they were acquainted throughout their childhoods, which developed some degree of respect between them. It was originally believed that Alec was first drafted into war at age 15. However, evidence was found that Darnes served alongside Kirby Smith in the Mexican War as early as 6 years old.
Now have pay voucher evidence that Evan Kirby Smith, then a captain in the U.S. Army, took him to Mexico in 1847 in the Mexican War. Darnes couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old.
In 1855, when Darnes was only 15, he became Kirby Smith's personal valet. While serving as valet, Darnes and Smith headed to the western frontier to participate in the Civil War. In 1861, the Civil War broke out. Darnes, being a slave for the Smith family, was required to fight on the southern side of the war. Throughout the war, he continued to serve as Kirby Smith's valet. Later, Smith became a captain in the U.S. Army for the Civil War. Darnes continued to serve him after Smith joined the Army for the Confederate States of America.
The first documented mention of Alexander Darnes was in a letter written on February 1st, 1845. The letter, which was addressed to Edmund Kirby Smith, was written by a man named Joseph L. Smith. After the war, Darnes was faced with a problem. Now that he was a freed slave, he would have to find a way to support himself. It has been predicted that Darnes, after living a great section of his early adulthood in the midst of war, began to aspire to become a doctor.
In the end, the side of the war Darnes had fought on had lost, but it was a win for him and the other slaves in the long run.
Well, he lived through a lot of bloody incidences during the Civil War, and now we know he was in the Mexican War. I mean, he saw the disease of army camp life. He saw, people being amputated. There's a very dramatic couple of sentences in his 17-page letter describing when he was waiting around to see whether Edmund had made it off the field at Bull Run alive, because he had initially been told at the headquarters that he was dead, and then he found him with the help of another army officer that he was in fact alive but unconscious, so Dr. Darnes had seen army medicine, at least, up close and personal.
Living through a war can change a person, so it might have inspired Darnes to pursue a career as a doctor. The issue with this ambition, essentially, was that it would be difficult to get the education required to do so, because even though Darnes was a freed slave, he was not respected or even viewed as remotely equal to men who were not of color. However, the Smith family decided to step in. Frances Smith Webster, the sister of Edmund, offered to pay for Darnes's education. He accepted, attending Lincoln University before graduating from Howard University with a medical degree in the year 1880.
Not only did he become the first African American physician in Jacksonville, but the first in the state of Florida. Darnes lived with his mother and nephew. His practice was in his house, which was burned down in the Great Fire of 1901, long after his death. Even after Darnes left the Smith family, their relationship was still strong.
Whenever General Smith came to a place where I was, he would always look me up and see me before he left.
As the virus swept through Jacksonville, many physicians abandoned their work in order to protect themselves and their families instead of their patients. However, Darnes remained behind in order to treat the infected in the hope that his services could help tamper the epidemic.
Despite the risk to his own health, Darnes continued to aid in the effort to control the yellow fever until the epidemic had finally passed.
Yes, there certainly were prejudice against blacks at that time. And people were desperate. Anybody who had some money, fled Jacksonville. It's estimated that half the population left during the yellow fever epidemic.
After his work to stop the spread of the yellow fever, Darnes was a highly respected man, even though he was African American. Darnes died on February 9, 1894. The cause of his death was unknown. Over 3,000 people attended his funeral, which was an enormous amount for both black and white men. Darnes earned himself a great amount of respect by staying behind and making such a difference.
Alexander Darnes's incredible story eventually faded as time passed, until his legacy burrowed into memories never recalled and his courage was forgotten. And even though this documentary may not make it far, even though we may not tell his story to many, we may still hold it high in our hearts. Alexander Darnes did so much for our city and so much for our states. He became the first African American physician in Florida, and he had to rise above racism and a lack of opportunity in order to do so. Thank you, Alexander Darnes.
We will never forget your story.